remember when I was very young, I loved to watch horror movies. I just loved the way they made me feel. I would never switch off the movie. I crave this adrenaline rush, that fear factor. You will think that you can get away with murder and everything's gonna work out well.
Maybe you break a law and you feel some painful consequences as a result.
It was like I was addicted to that fear, not in a good way, because I've ended up, not being able to sleep.
Life is difficult, life is a bit painful. If you have an issue and somebody points that out to you, yes, it might be a bit painful, but they could be really useful as well, because it encourages you to then do something about it. So fear, what do we know? Well, we know that everybody experiences it. So there's nobody who's going to be watching or listening to us who does not have a understanding of what we're talking about. And yeah, maybe it's a little bit different for everybody, and it comes like pain. Maybe it comes in different intensities. Maybe there's different types of fear. What's some types of fear? Fear of the unknown, so what might happen. Fear of the known, what's happened before and might happen again. As I was thinking about it, I thought, well, fear isn't always a bad thing. Like, people like fear. There's fear that people opt for, as in a scary, terrifying ride at the carnival, or whatever you want to call it. Everybody has different names for that thing. A scary movie. Like, why do people choose that?
Because you crave the emotion, I guess.
So, but there's a control aspect to that. So it's not. There's a safety aspect of that fear. You get it, but you get it in a known quantity, and you have faith in the end of it to some extent. The safety aspect, like, you're not going to come flying off this ride.
Hopefully.
This is a movie, so you're kind of going to come out the end. It's not reality. Whereas the unknown aspect is a really interesting aspect where you don't have control. That's when people seem to have a different interaction with that experience.
Yeah, sometimes they go into extremes. And that's why sometimes the fear is reasonable. But I think that more often than not, the fear is only a figment of our imagination. 99% of the cases when we were actually afraid of something, these things never come into fruition. So that would be quite strong indication that maybe the fear is not that bad, and maybe these predictions should not be. How do I say this? I'm not trying to mitigate the fear, because usually we have really valid reasons why we fear of something. But like I said, by nature, I think that we always predict way worse outcome than it actually is going to be. Of course, there are advantages to this. For instance, if you're preparing for some sort of exam, if you're not fearful, then you're probably not going to put that much effort to, during the learning, because who cares? Whereas if you introduce that aspect of fear and the pressure, let's say, if I'm not going to pass that exam, I'm not going to be able to graduate to another level, and perhaps I'm not going to be able to get some sort of promotion at work, and so on and so forth. So in these situations, it can work as a motivating factor, but at the same time, when you're in a state of fear, you're not as productive and you don't think as clearly as you would otherwise, because I think it has significant impact on your working memory and on your capacity of concentrate on one thing or another, because you always have this fear at the back of your mind that's not helping very often. So rather than focusing on the end goal, you're trying to focus on all these, possible worst-case scenarios and what happens then when the day of the exam comes. Rather than being relaxed and at your best, you're being so scared and on your toes that there's a higher chance of you failing. Because even though you have this information available because of all the study you put in, this information is not easily accessible because you are under great deal of hormones of stress. even right now when speaking, I'm trying not to look like a fool. So I can feel that my heart rate goes up. And we said to ourselves that there's no need to be worried. There's no pressure. We can always delete that stuff. But it is hard for me to forget about, these cameras. And I do want to perform my best. But I'm finding, based on my own experience, that during our conversations, I'm not as relaxed as I am, when we're speaking off the camera, which makes it challenging. And yeah, on one hand, it's a challenge, but on the other hand, it's the fear of being judged, fear of being ridiculed. And
I like that saying. Everybody says to you to relieve your fear, oh, what's the worst that could happen? Yeah, that's pretty bad. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's the thing. When you say a lot of it occurs in our imagination, it's not that it's not real. I think that's what you're saying. What I'm hearing from you is there's an aspect of fear which is our conjecture of what is the possibilities. And some of those might be, how likely are they in reality? And yeah, so it is a tangible, it is a real thing. It's not like we're just imagining these things. It's not imaginary fear. Well, you do get imaginary fears, but there is a rational fear. There's a rational fear which is perfectly reasonable. So what are the rational fears? If we drive too fast, we may get a speeding fine because there's cameras that can detect our speed. If we walk around punching people, we might get arrested. There's so many things in our life, there's so many rules, it feels like, that there's so many opportunities to live in constant fear and anxiety. So how do you differentiate between the potential manifestation of those things and the realistic manifestation? Because often, yeah, how do we balance that? And I'm not saying like you need to answer that, like it's a really difficult one to do. But it's an interesting aspect of fear, especially fear and how it affects us in our modern life.
I think that by default, our minds are biased towards negativity. And very often when we anticipate the worst case scenario, we're not trying to question our reasoning as to why we're thinking that this is going to be the outcome. And I think that if you ever get to the point that you're really, really stressed out about something, if you're going to have an honest conversation with yourself, you're going to ask yourself, what is the actual likelihood of that thing happening if A, B, C, or D conditions are going to happen at the same time? So what I mean here is that once you start questioning whether or not this particular outcome is possible, you realize that, for instance, I'll give another analogy, which is also an exam. If you think that I'm going to fail and this exam is going to be a disaster and I'm going to get fired or so on and so forth, that's not really going to, that could work as a motivating factor. But if you're going to be honest with you, if you say to yourself, well, listen, if I'll study at least 1 or 2 hours a day, in 2-3 months, the chances of me failing that exam are really, really low. And I think that very often there's a lot that we have under our control. And once you realize that, let's say you're fearful of something, but at the same time, you know that there are certain things you can do to mitigate that, there's a really high chance that this worst case scenario may never happen. And I think that's one of the biggest problems, because we normally don't have these open conversations with ourselves, because when that thought comes into our mind, we just become, fearful of it, and we don't have this open conversation. We don't trying to reason with ourselves, trying to find any grounds to believe that this is exactly what's going to happen. So, yeah, the solution would be to talk to yourself and to find out, to have an open conversation with yourself and find out how likely the worst case scenario is really going to happen. But either way, it isn't going to take away the anxiety. So what I'm saying is, this is one of the methods of tackling that fear, but it's not gonna fix anything. At the same time, you could use it as a motivation. So if you think that, okay, this is the worst case scenario, this is what may happen, but I need to put maximum effort to minimize that likelihood. So I think that would be a healthy way of looking at it.
So it sounds like what you're saying is increase your control to reduce your fear. So how do you increase the control? You're suggesting you try and use logic to say, what are the chances of this happening in your exam? That's the example you gave. And I think that's great. I think is it two different systems working at once? Because fear's an emotion, and what you're suggesting is to bring along logic and statistics and evaluation and analysis and bring them into play to reduce the emotion. And I think that works pretty well. Is it the solution? I don't know. I think it's a solution that I feel has helped me in the past. I think both aspects. One is the looking at things in a more logical, analytical way. And what you do when you do that, you're looking at reality. Because there's two ways to look at reality. Well, there's probably lots of ways to look at reality, but one is through your emotions, the lens of your emotions, and one is through the lens of your mind and an analytical way of statistics and facts that you can verify. And so, yeah, it's really useful to do that. The other aspect is control. And that changes the fear itself. That changes the emotion. So here's an example. So my kids asked me, what was the scariest movie I've ever seen? And so I'm thinking, what was the scariest movie I've ever seen? And the answer I gave, and I think it's the truth, I watched It the Clown. Now on paper, that's not particularly, it's a scary movie, but it's a 15, it's not an 18. However, the context was living in the countryside, in a house with no curtains, so it's pitch dark outside, so somebody could be looking in at you, you don't know, and I'm not with anybody. Nobody's in the house, I'm about 12 years old. I don't think I was supposed to be watching this movie, to be fair, but maybe that adds to it as well,
yeah.
Slight feeling of guilt. And it got to the bit with the balloon popping in the sink. I had to put it off. It was too scary. However, I know if there'd been somebody with me, it wouldn't have been an issue. Now, that's got something to do with the control aspect of the fear. There's more control over the fear for me. It's the same. I used to regularly have to walk in the dark at night, a few miles home, if I'd been to my friend's house. And on a moonless night, that's quite scary on your own. With somebody else, it's a little bit scary, but it's a completely different experience. And so what's going on there, to me, I don't know that I've got more control, but there's a change. There's a change to the dynamic of the emotion of fear. What do you think? What do you think is going on there?
I think that your perception of the world is completely different when you're 12. I remember when I was very young, I loved to watch horror movies. I just loved the way they made me feel. I would never switch off the movie. I crave this adrenaline rush, that fear factor, and I would actually seek these type of experiences. And I was actually looking forward to having a horror dreams, nightmares, which is completely bonkers for most people. I think this is just kind of creature that I am. But I think that to the certain degree, you're right. If there's uncertainty, especially when you're very, very young, everything seems to be more dangerous. But I think that, again, when you're that young, you're still quite dependent on your parents. So you're not completely grown in a way, you're not mature enough to understand whether or not something is worth the risk. And the problem is, when it comes to fear, like you said, with the control, and also with the level of fear. Because I think that depending on the level of fear and whether or not you can control it, that'll indicate how it'll affect your ability to think straight and clear. Because the higher the fear level, less likely you'll be able to think clear and analytically. Because, the possible worst case scenario outcome is so overwhelming that most of us would just forget about any logic and reasoning at that point. And I've seen it in me in the past. When there was I remember it was a first independence referendum, I was petrified. Now, I had these really dark a prediction in my mind that literally the whole world's going to collapse. It's going to be end of the world if something will change. And in reality, I've never had any evidence to believe that. And more I studied, more I realized that this wouldn't be the case. But it didn't stop me from trying to go back to read the same papers and experience that fear more. It was like I was addicted to that fear, not in a good way, because I've ended up, not being able to sleep, not being able to think about anything else other than that. And I was always ranting, that nobody's listening and all this, all that, and now in the retrospect, I'm thinking, I have no idea why I was doing this. How easily I was manipulated by media to believe in something that could have never happened. And that's the scariest part of fear, when media are actually weaponizing it against us. And not many people talk about it or think about it for that matter, but this is exactly what I've been experiencing for past 10 years. There's always something, on the horizon, a reason to be fearful, a reason to be petrified, a reason to hate one another, thinking that, that there's this polarization that's being created. And before, I didn't really think about it much. I was just either fearful or absolutely angry with somebody else. And now, as I grow a little older, I start realizing is that it feels like these, I don't know, I don't want to, come out with any conspiracy theories again, but I just think sometimes that they're doing it purposely to divide us, to keep us engaged, because what's the better way of keeping us engaged other than scaring us to death and needing us to come back for more information?
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective on a particular aspect of fear, and I guess what you're looking at there is its ability to control you, and to motivate as well. So you're talking about the tactic of fear to motivate people to vote and to think in a certain direction. It's like, look out, if you do this, then this bad things could happen.
Scaremongering, yeah.
Well, yes, yeah, that's the name, and it happens a lot in politics, and it's tricky because it works quite well. I think it's quite effective. I think one potential negative of that I think exists is that when you tell people of fear, and you say and you sell it as if this is an almost definite thing that's going to happen.
Exactly.
And then it doesn't. And you do that enough times, people then switch off and they become unfearful. It's like the boy that cried wolf. He's shouting wolf and everybody's panicking, running to their houses. But then he does it another 3 or 4 times. And then when he does shout it, nobody believes it, because it's like, well, it didn't happen this time, it didn't happen this time. So they've got all these occurrences. And I think we interact with fear very much in that way. If you're told, if a child's told, don't touch the fire or you'll burn yourself, and he goes and he touches it several times when it's off, and it's cold and it's cold and it's cold, and it's like, fire, not too scary. That's a rubbish analogy, but never mind. The point is that if fears don't manifest, if they don't happen, if somebody keeps getting away with shoplifting or committing a crime and never being caught and persecuted for it, then there's the potential that they'll think that the fear will be reduced. Another aspect of that is the opposite aspect. Or do you want to say anything about that first of all, because I'm going to kind of move on. I was going to look at the opposite, which is something that we've both experienced, which we're speaking about. Whereas when you maybe you break a law and you feel some painful consequences as a result, it really has the effect that it makes you think twice about breaking that law in the future.
Yeah, but I think that the important aspect here is also the upbringing. That's the one part. And also how early in your life you'll get to that point. And, it can be something simple. It can be something as silly as driving your car without an insurance. And even if it's unknowingly, you'll end up, in the court and you'll get punished. And that could work as a huge deterrent and will introduce that enormous fear in you. And that can be a good thing, That could be absolutely good thing, because
Yeah,
if
yeah.
that works for you, that means that you're probably not going to make the same mistake ever again, because you know that there are consequences. Whereas if you're going to manage to get away with these things for extended period of time, you will think that you can get away with murder and everything's going to work out well. And this is a recipe for disaster, basically. Sooner or later, you will get caught. And unfortunately, who knows how many people you will hurt in the meantime, while getting to that point.
Well, I could take it in a different direction slightly, but
Okay.
extrapolate on what you're saying into something a little bit beyond fear, but interesting. So I guess with the current, the situation and the tensions between left and conservative and liberal,
Yes.
there's a story which conservatives present, which is that if you allow people to be too soft and give them all these safe spaces and all the not to have the pushback from society and the pain and the in a healthy way, because like life is difficult, life is a bit painful. If you have an issue and somebody points that out to you, yes, it might be a bit painful, but they could be really useful as well, because it encourages you to then do something about it. Vis-a-vis, if you break a law and you suffer the penalty, then it might cause you to change your actions in the future. So I think that's a message which comes through, the conservative message, and there's probably something pretty valid there.
It's a very positive message. And I think that, based on my own experience, I can confirm that it definitely works. So every single time that certain type of fear is introduced in my life, it usually forces me to take action and to do something, to mitigate these factors. So when I woke up and I found out that Britain voted Brexit, my first thought was that, my future was uncertain. So what I had to do as a result, I had to become a British citizen.
Do you not think you would have pursued British citizenship had that not happened?
Yeah, I'm quite certain, because prior to that, I didn't feel the need.
Mm-hmm.
I thought about it before, but I never felt the necessity of getting that piece of paper that would confirm that I'm also a British citizen. Whereas that fear that was created in my mind made me believe that this is going to be the end of the world. And unless I have that citizenship, there's a high chance that, I'll get deported or something like that. This was unrealistic fear at the time, but I could only base my way of thinking on what I've heard in the media and what I've heard from other people. And that was absolutely petrifying. So I used this as a fuel for me to prepare for the exam to become a British citizen, and to quickly save some money to pay for the application. And ultimately I was successful, which is great. But that's one of the examples. I feel that if it wasn't for that, if it wasn't for the fear of perhaps losing ability to take part in society, basically, because I was really afraid I'm going to lose my rights. I was afraid that maybe we were even going to be deported as a result. Although realistically, thinking, I knew that, well, listen, I've been living in this country for 15 years. I've not been breaking the law, so I have no reason to believe that anyone would ever wanted to deport me. But then again, that's the fear. It is justified, but it's not real. This is something they were just conjuring in our mind, and it worked as the agent that pushed me where to get that citizenship. Mm-hmm. And this is something I would have never done without it. And don't get me wrong, I'm happy that I've done it, and now I can vote in the general election. Not that I'm going to next year, because after everything I've seen that's happening in the parliament, I don't think I trust any of them with my vote, which is sad, but that's sad state of affairs these days, unfortunately.
So what about things that are real fears? So for instance, I'll give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to sit your driving licence and you don't have a driving licence, if you don't pass, then you won't have a driving license. So that's not really that's definitely going to be the situation.
Okay.
So that's a foregone conclusion.
But you don't really have that fear element in that. The only fear is, okay, I'm not going to have a license. That means I won't be able to drive. And if I've managed to live all my life without the license, this isn't going to make that much of a difference. Whereas if you're facing the situation, if I'll commit that crime, there's a chance I may go to prison. There's a high chance that I'll end up with a criminal record, which will have a direct impact on my ability to do certain types of jobs. And I think this type of fear could be positive. And I think this is a good thing that we have that fear. Although I think that most people by nature are good people.
So I'll stop you there, because you're giving two different examples.
Okay.
So one is an example of the driving license. So the young people in particular are tested and tested and tested. So through schooling, so there's exams, there's all these tests. As adults, we receive tests as well. You have a test as well. So they have big consequences if you don't. The crime is a different thing, because it's if you. So let me think. The driving test is if you don't achieve this, then you fail. The crime is a choice. It's like if you do this, there's a consequence. So those are two different things with different type of fear that's attached to them. So the crime one, yes. Well, I mean, that's how our society works. We have punishments for those who break our laws and consequences. And that is part of the aspect which keeps control. There's other aspects in which you hope that people will be moral. That they are, because we're each individually moral agents, so that we do the right things because it's the right thing to do. So I'm all for laws. Laws are fantastic, but there's a limitation to that system, and too many are not good.
Of course, and we could talk. This is a topic for a completely different conversation, I think, because yes, unfortunately, law is black and white. There's not really a grey area. And that can be a bit problematic. But I think that we went a little bit off the topic.
I don't think so. No, we're talking about fear. So it's very... Well, you took it to that topic, about law, about breaking laws. So
because I didn't feel that the driver license test was a good enough example to introduce any fear. I remember when I was doing, my exam. So my only fear was, if I'm not going to pass, I'm going to have to reset my exam. And that's it. At the time when I was like 17 years old, I didn't really need a license. It was a luxury. That was a gift from my parents. I appreciated it. But I didn't really feel that there was any sort of fear.
For you?
For me.
But for somebody else who's got a different circumstance, like get the driving license, get the job, don't get the driving license, don't get the job.
Of course.
I think financially as well, it depends on the circumstances you're in. It might be if you don't get because there's quite a cost involved in driving license.
Yes.
So if your circumstances is, if you don't pass this driving license, there ain't going to be any more money for you to try again for another year or two, then the consequences for you are higher, so the fear is likely to be higher. I mean, come on, think of tests. What about other tests where it's like, pass this test and get into the university, don't pass it, don't get in. Like there's a lot of fear in tests. It's like, yeah.
But I think that
the consequences.
Yeah, but that's a bit of a problem in my opinion, because when you put such a high level of fear, if you introduce such a high level of fear into someone's life, it's not really turning them into a more productive person. Yes, it will motivate them a lot, but for the purposes of the exam, they're not going to perform at their best because they're not going to be relaxed. They're going to be petrified that if they're going to fail, it's going to be a disaster. That's probably one of the reasons why so many people tend to fail the exams.
Why do you think you know that? Because I don't know if that's true.
I'm speaking based on my own experience. Higher level of fear in me prior to the exam, regardless of my level of preparation, higher chances of me failing the exam. And the best example was my diploma in public interpreting a couple of years ago when I went for my exam. And although I've been studying 2-3 hours a day, I believe that the reason why I failed on the day was the level of stress I was under on the day. I was so stressed out that I can't even remember half of the things that happened during that test. I felt like I was in a frenzy. I was shaking, and my brain just didn't work at my best. So my mind worked at its best when I'm in a positive mind, when I'm relaxed. Whereas, when I'm under a great deal of stress and pressure, I'm not performing that well. So I guess that we're all different. And for some, maybe it will work better than for others. But I think this is the
I think you have a point there. You're onto something, and I think what you're talking about is the common conception of fight, flight, or freeze. So how we react when that emotion of fear comes upon us may differ, not just from individual to individual, but also depending on the type of fear and the stories that are attached to it, and the levels of control, the levels of consequences which we feel are likely to be the outcome.
Which very often is just conjured by our mind. So, for instance, when it comes to the particular exam that I'm referring to, it wasn't a necessity for me to get that. It was, I just wanted to get extra qualification. And so on the face of it, I didn't really have a reason to be so fearful. And I've ended up, failing this part of the exam. I've passed other parts, but not that one. Because of this unrealistic fear. Because in my mind, I felt like if I'm not going to pass that exam, I'm going to lose my job. Completely ridiculous. But that is the way my mind works. And I think that, I envy people who can, keep it under control.
Well, yeah, the tricky thing is, with hindsight, you can look back and go, yeah, it wasn't really realistic. But when you're actually in that spot, in that moment, maybe you're about to step into a stage in front of hundreds of thousands of people and give a speech, you can look back in hindsight and that's lovely, but when you're in that situation, and you were in that situation, you had the test, and it does other things. I think it often has the potential to affect your identity. It's like I'm a winner or a loser. I certainly feel like with tests, if I fail something, I'm like, oh man, I didn't think this would hurt like this, but this is painful. I remember I did the driving test, and the driving instructor, he asked me at the end, how do you think you did? And I said, yeah, I think I did pretty good. You failed.
That was very, very unprofessional of him.
Well,
why would you even ask? How did you think? How it
maybe
went?
he thought
Maybe he thought that was funny.
No, maybe he thought that I would say, I don't know if I did so well. Maybe that's what most people would say. For some reason, I thought I'd done really well. Obviously not. So yeah, there's a lot of things attached to failing. It's like, it's painful. It's painful to fail.
Is.
And so that's not an unrealistic fear. Fear. It's an interesting topic.
Very interesting.
And I guess we've just skimmed the surface, and it'd be great to hear other people's take on what they think with what we've said, but where they disagree, or where they can elaborate and say, yeah, what about this aspect of fear? Because we've only just skimmed the surface. Yeah,
and I guess that if people were to tell us that, yeah, we would really like you to discuss this particular aspect of fear, yeah, I think we would be quite open to do a little bit of research and then dive into that conversation. And I think that for today, that would be everything. So thank you so much for watching. If you have any comments, they're always welcome. And if you enjoyed our today's conversation, please hit the like. Also, if you enjoyed it, you may consider subscribing to our channel. Thank you so much, and we'll see you again next week.
Bye.